Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Sebastian Unger. I would like to thank all the organizers of this conference, as well as my host university, the National Karazin University of Kharkiv, and yeah, where I'm working as a DAD lecturer since fourth semesters. I will begin my presentation right away in order not to lose any time, since it contains a lot of material. One thing in advance, to order to make it easier to follow my line of thought, I've decided to copy most of the script directly into the slides. All quotations shown from my sources are my own translation and therefore not official. The title of my presentation is The Transformation of the West as Mirrored by the East: Perspectives on the German Reunification. I will introduce the topic with two graphics, then shed light on a debate that emerged in 2023-24 in Germany around the issue of East German identities, and subsequently take a closer look to two representatives of this debate. I will share my presentation. I would like to start by showing this simple graphic. It depicts the ghostly resurgence of the topographical contours of the dissolved state of GDR, here appearing 35 years after Germany's reunification in the form of the AfD's election results, the so-called Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, a far-right populist party at the 2025 parliamentary elections, represented in varying shades of blue. What this means, particularly for core political issues that manifest as European and global challenges, is clear to most of us. Beyond the dangers of historical relativization, particularly with regard to Germany's past, the following are some examples: erosion of democratic norms, strained international cooperation, undermining of European integration, normalization of exclusionary rhetoric, erosion of European and transatlantic unity. The question that concerns me and from which I intend to develop a thesis is connected to the internal German East-West divide. My primary interest lies in whether this should be understood similar maybe to the case of the United States, merely as a social configuration that in Germany manifests itself as a pronounced re-solidification of formerly national, today international boundaries as a result of neglected problems in the unification process, or whether additional factors are at play. These factors may offer insight into how Germany understands itself in the current political and global context, and conversely, how Germany understands the European and global problem landscape through the prism of its internal challenges, and arguably also taking cover behind them. Before moving on, I want to show another graphic that has a strange correspondence with the first one, the point of intersection. This statistic from 2025 illustrates the vote shares of the strongest far-right parties in the most recent parliamentary elections in Europe. From this data, we can already draw some initial evidence which either contrast with the first slide or reflect the question that this presentation seeks to explore. The German situation is distorted by the statistical presentation, as one part of the country deviates strongly upward from the overall result. At the same time, Eastern European EU societies shaped by post-socialist transformation appear to be more strongly affected. Overall, however, it appears to reflect the state of Europe as a whole, as a geopolitical problem. What should be done with these three evidences? Can they be considered together? Do Eastern European post-transformation societies respond more strongly through right-wing voting to contemporary geopolitical challenges, not merely due to historical and cultural predispositions, but as part of a shared European problem constellations, but expressed in a distinct way? Finally, is the statistical absorption of the former GDR not itself indicative of an underlying conflict internalized at the European level and statistically erased, yet externalized within Germany as the otherness of the former East? While Eastern European states are European internalized, especially when Europe must assert itself internationally, facing many challenges, yet simultaneously externalized within Europe as deviant states. The question is, wouldn't it rather be necessary to recognize the problem as a genuinely political and common to the global renationalization period and its cultural backlash? In that regard, this presentation is not about the East Germany, GDR. The question is, to what extent the East served as a focal point through which these broader transformations in Germany's political situation become visible. I will introduce the debate around it in 2023-24 that flared up in Germany and whose emerged cannot be explained in monocausal terms, for instance, solely as a reaction to the electoral success of the AfD. Rather, it becomes apparent that themes and lines of conflict that had already existed were rendered newly, and in some cases for the first time at all, articulable through changes in modes of political discourse, the broader identity political shift within left liberal debates, the question, for instance, of appropriation and authorization of experience, and the influence of post-colonial discourses have opened new forms of political articulation. At the same time, they introduce, particularly in the domestic East-West conflict, new lines of conflict within an already simmering field of problems, namely the political representation of a group that cannot be constituted through classical identity political markers, and yet, in the history of the last 3 decades following reunification, has been exposed to significant structural disadvantages within the German domestic framework, the East Germans. While from the perspective of the post-colonial discourse, they largely appear unusable as members of a white privileged industrial society, their specific colonization experience is no less real, and herein lies a central dilemma. The real experience of structural marginalization can only be translated into the framework of identity political recognition logics to a limited extent. What was also special about this debate, that it was primarily led by East Germans themselves. One of the central triggers was Dirk Oschmann's book Der Osten, eine westdeutsche Erfindung, The East, a West German invention, to which I will return in more detail, since it exemplifies a dilemma in dealing with new forms of political critique, which even its author is not necessarily aware of. In addition, ideas resurfaced that required renewed attention in the face of the urgent need to counteract the impending shift to the right, even if they reiterated central patterns of thought from the discourse of domination, but this time formulated from an East German perspective. Ilko Sasha Kowalczuk, for instance, diagnosed in this context a freedom shock experienced by many East Germans after 1989, which he understands as the cause of authoritarian longings. Implicitly, he thus critiques arguments like those of Oschmann as victim discourses that amplify resentments rather than prompting democratic self-empowerment. Another component of the debate manifests itself in the literary field, particularly regarding questions of who is allowed to write about the East, whether East German authors are expected to address East German topics, and conversely, whether West German or late-born authors may write fictionally about the East. Here too, tensions between identity politics and artistic freedom emerge, indicating that this is not merely a continuation or respective the election success is an escalation of the old intra-German unification conflict. Finally, a conciliatory position is taken by Steffen Mau, who in his book Ungleich vereint demonstrates that German reunification, despite formal alignment, has led to persistently unequal living conditions, and that these structural differences, along with the existing political and cultural predispositions, can nevertheless be endured if the way is found to become aware of them and to restore trust in democratic institutions through greater political participation. Due to time constraints, I will simplify my focus to Mao and Othman in order to make visible precisely what has been left blind, that no side in the debate seems to recognize that the forms of political representation have fundamentally changed in the recent years, also beyond the East-West question, and that this constitutes a third dimension of the debate in which the struggle over interpretive authority between East and West is only the superficial appearance. The third dimension thus allows for a shift in discourse. It is genuinely something new, a promise, a way to approach an old problem differently. At the same time, it prevents a solution. Herein lies the great dilemma, which also makes visible a transformation in the political culture of the West, its increasing depoliticization. To make these two lines of conflict visible, I proceed in a crosswise manner. I agree with Mao substantively in every respect, while at the same time denying that he has made a meaningful contribution to the debate. Conversely, I disagree with Othman in many points, yet I recognize his representation in which this line of conflict simmers so openly precisely for the fact that it makes the problem visible, even though unintentionally. Let's start with Steffen Mau, a professor of sociology at Humboldt University of Berlin. He approaches his analysis with a deep understanding of how the East remains socially disadvantaged even after a long process of integration into the Western frame. I start with a quote: "Inequality in this area appears virtually cemented in place. It changes only very slowly, even across generations. The frequently voiced complaint of being second-class citizens presumably has less to do with concrete experiences of discrimination or with restricted rights as citizens, and more with a structural social underprivileging. 30% work in the low-wage sector, and there's a clear hierarchy in these two societies, West and East Germany. While the West is more middle-class oriented, the East is an ordinary wage earner society, indeed, a country of ordinary people. From this starting point, Mao identifies a chain reaction where social structures generate democratic effects that make the problem difficult to solve internally. In the East, the population has declined to the level of 1905, and the share of those aged over 65 is significantly larger. And there's also a masculinization, since there's a female East-West migration going on. And this, again, leads to a propensity for violence and makes it difficult on the partnership market. There's a demographical problem going on. Building on these measurable social inequalities, Mao examines cultural factors in East and West to understand this. In the German reality, we are presumably not dealing with fundamentally different cultures of interpretation, but subtly and almost unnoticed recognizable differences in political culture have become entrenched. This becomes evident in the retrospective assessment of the GDR, in views of the transformation process and in evaluation of concrete socio-political issues. Thus, for example, the GDR and socialism are viewed comparatively more leniently in the East, and narratives of loss are more widespread, the West perceived the reunification as a completed process. More central than these cultural predispositions, which arose from the GDR's socialization, is the loss of political self-efficacy in the East, the question of actual and perceived political participation. Mao describes a lock-in situation. I quote, "The transition from the peaceful revolution to German unity can be interpreted as having been slowed down. Precisely at the moment when East Germans began to constitute themselves as political subjects, when forums of negotiating social relations emerged and a language developed through which interests could be articulated and formulated, a strong depolitization set in towards reunification. The Federal Republic sought to roll back grassroots democratic experiments and new unconventional forms of participation, such as the Round Table. They were simply regarded as incompatible and dysfunctional, as disruptive foreign bodies whose disappearance was considered no great loss." In his analysis, Mao identifies three main threads in research interpreting the divergent political behavior of East Germans. In addition to classical factors such as social disadvantage, dissatisfaction with the party democracy, and deficits in democratic experience stemming from GDR era conceptions, he emphasizes that the core issue is a feeling of not being included or lack of perceived political self-efficacy. In summary, Mao warns of the danger of gradual erosion of democracy through the incremental establishment of illiberal attitudes, habituation to radicalized vocabulary, and the successive abandonment of democratic consensus. He also critiques counter-strategies against right-wing populism, which often reinforce the victimhood narrative, ignore rural Eastern contexts, and underestimates complex social networks. Mao emphasizes that alongside accelerating social convergence in wages and pensions, the crucial task is not to assume East-West differences will disappear, but rather to understand and endure these differences to protect democracy. New participation formats could help to restore political self-efficacy in the East, for instance, through citizen councils, especially on emotionally charged issues, in generating impulses for democratic empowerment. While Mao's leniency extended to those socialized through the GDR, and its aftermath is based on facts that, in my point of view, are overall correct, I want to present three criticisms on this account, especially ones that take Mao's main argument seriously, that of the lack of participation in the democratic process. Okay. Here we are. To externalize a collective problem. Mao's explanatory approach fails to take the East seriously in that there can be no adequate sociological, economic explanation for right-wing populist movements emerging in only one part of the country, nor should there be, without also taking into account the present situation as a whole, the current circumstances of all those involved. For doing so, one would at least have to concede that the problem child is on the wrong track in an acute relation to the present, which is also the wrong track of all those who have allowed things to come to this point. The question should not be relativized as what have we done to provoke them, whataboutism, nor what counter-strategies have we chosen that add fuel to the fire, as if it is only a question of strategy and not content, but rather, who are we to have allowed this to happen? Who are we to have such opponents? And who are we to allow again the causes of this to be lost in translation, in alienating one part of the country with historical and cultural explanations, since we, ironically, through our understanding, thereby silence what it could tell us about ourselves and the state of the political discourse? It is a questionable we that is used provocatively here. The understanding expressed in such an explanatory model is no less marginalizing than the accusation that the East is incapable of democracy because of its past. This understanding is no better than the accusation if it applies the legitimate investigation of causes and reasons only in a particular way, thereby abandoning the primacy of political analysis. Inequality exists in both the East and the West. Inequality, rampant, unequal distribution of wealth in one of the largest economies worldwide, and the widening social gap are problems inherent in the system. This does not contradict the need to address the injustices in the process of reunification. One does not exclude the other, nor can it be denied that the GDR was a dictatorship. However, the diagnosis of disadvantage must not seal off the political access to the situation. But coming to terms with the past and understanding the present unwittingly serve to politically invalidate the problem. At the same time, the deviation of the East indirectly becomes an unconditional endorsement of the target society into which it is necessary to integrate. There's a loss of distance in political critique. Denial of political agency. One of the points Mao particularly emphasizes with regard to the great opportunities missed in the process of reunification is that the East was no longer able to exercise its political self-efficacy. However, there's a fatal irony in this argument. The fact that an understanding of the difficulties, problems, and peculiarities of the East offers a sufficient explanation for its current political deviation leads to the East being denied a political responsiveness to the present that would be more than the sum of its reasons. It would therefore be a strategy, perhaps the most effective one, to decisively counteract the emerging right-wing populist force in the East. After all, 2026 is an election year in which, for the first time, East German federal states could be governed by the AfD. To grant the East, even in its errors, even in its fatal misjudgment of the supposedly alternative past, the very self-efficacy, political agency that was lost. To acknowledge its ability to respond to problems that affect the entire country, even if this response requires a decisive no, because it poses a danger to everyone, not at least to the East itself. But ironically here, it is precisely in the necessary concessions that the West must make regarding its mistakes in the unification process that the East is once again not being taken seriously, which at the same time undermines the basis of being able to contradict it. Okay, let's go on with Oshman. Look, Oshman argues that the post-1990 position of East Germany is a result of an asymmetric process of unification in which West German actors exercised institutional, discursive, and symbolic dominance. Professor of Literature in Leipzig, and we talk about the book Der Osten eine westdeutsche Erfindung, 2023. The East functions less as an empirical category than as a construct produced by politics and media, one that marks deviation from West German norms and thereby legitimizes existing power relations. According to Oshman, this construction has lasting consequences for political representation, elite recruitment, especially in the academic field, and the perceived legitimacy of state institutions. I will read this quote. The West rather decisively interpreted the self-liberation of the East as a victory of the West. Since 1990, the East has experienced being fundamentally excluded from the actual shaping and co-shaping of this democracy. While there are formal opportunities, in reality, there are only very limited chances of participation, representation, entry into, or even advancement within socially relevant subsystems. To accuse the East of hostilities to democracy under these premises is not only cynical, but also follows a century-old pattern of domination and discourse through which Western colonialism of various kinds has sought to justify its hegemony. Whew, sorry for that. Othman's book does not develop a clear argumentative climax. It largely remains stationary in its reasoning. In many respects, it retrains the character of a pamphlet, which extensive enumerations and a clearly perceptible anger at the condition it describes. The examples cited often add little that is new to the central thesis and are only insufficiently interpreted. More noteworthy than this substantive level, however, is the question of why Oshman is writing this book precisely now, 32 years after reunification. The chosen moment is no more explicitly explained in the book than is the answer to the question of the speaker position that Oshman himself raises. Why should he, as someone whose social position as a professor of literature is in fact secured, write a book at this particular time? Unlike other authors, Oshman does not begin from the alleged danger posed to democracy by developments in the East and its voting behavior. He does not open with references to the AfD, the global shift to the right, or the collapse of democracy, but rather states, in essence, that he, as an East German, has had enough of the mechanisms underlying the construction of the East. His starting point thus lies in a key aspect of the problem of representation itself. The author's unease surrounding these questions of who is speaking, why now, and what critical instruments are being used here reveals an underlying trace. It is a shift within the discourse itself that seems to both inspire and provoke Oshman, promising the possibility of scattering dominant narratives, while at the same time making it impossible for East Germans to align themselves fully with the new set of tools. This becomes clear in two juxtaposed quotations. By the skin of their teeth, that is, with only 338 votes to 320, the Bundestag decided in the mid-90s to move from the Rhineland to Berlin as an old to the new capital. All West German civil servants who went east received lavish special payments, so-called Buschzulage, Buschbonus. According to Wikipedia, it is a colloquial term for the allowance paid to imperial German officials sent to the colonial territories of Africa. Instead of jointly adopting a new constitution and a new anthem, the West fell back on a program called Aufbau Ost. In the correspondence between Christoph Hein and Elmar Faber, a well-known author and a publisher from the East, one can read that the term Aufbau Ost originates from the Third Reich. The planning office of the Reichskommissariat developed the plan for the colonization and Germanization of parts of Eastern Europe. Why does one use this language in 1990? Oshman explicitly and implicitly draws on motives of contemporary post-colonial discourse. Central to this approach um, are concepts such as othering, epistemic asymmetry, and discursive semantic hegemony, and he transfers it to the intra-German context. At the same time, however, Oschmann unconsciously delineates the limits that this adopted discursive procedure intrinsically imposes on him in the form of an identity dilemma. This becomes evident in a second quotation from the equally central opening section, which addresses the question of the speaker's position, to which he devotes an entire chapter. Wer oder was bin ich? I'm an East German. This is to say, I'm right-handed and left-footed, a passionate cyclist, a professor of modern German literature, and so on, describing himself as a not distinguishable, normal middle-class person in the entire German society with no distinctive marks, that make him visible as one with an Eastern background. From another perspective, however, I'm nothing more than a representative of a highly problematic system of domination, part of the establishment, namely a relatively old white man who, as a professor, deals almost exclusively with canonical text in research and teaching, text by authors who can themselves be described as dead and old white men, authors such as Lessing, Goethe, Schiller, Kleist. Admittedly, some of these authors were not old when they died. Beyond their respective short lifespans, what unites them is an insistent questioning of law and justice. Substantive reasons for such a corpus hardly matter for this perspective. Only what is superficially visible counts: man, white, professor, thus gender, skin color, social position. In this context, the postcolonial discourse appears to him as double-bind. On the one hand, it enables him to embark on a new path that is not already foreclosed by West German-shaped domination. The postmodern political language allows him to recognize structural East-West asymmetries according to the pattern similar to that employed by other minorities and by the Global South. This gives rise to a non-identity of East Germans, one who, unlike the other marginalized groups that can mobilize the emancipatory moment of these tools in order to assure oneself of who one is or who one is not, simultaneously leads to a dead end. This is not only due to a lack of positive identity markers, but above all in terms of a common reference system of the non-other, which one faces as an other in an exclusionary, demarcating manner. Here, there is no outside, only individual memory. The sheer forces in the new forms of discourse place him in a tension between the possibilities and the looming impossibility of connecting to forms of identity politics. The moment in which participation in the dismantling of hegemonic discourses becomes possible is also the moment in which the counter-discourse marks itself as insufficiently universal and politically suspect. To return once more to Mao, the call for freedom of East Germans seems to have been overwritten for the first time in involuntary relinquishment of political participation, with a pre-established system of freedoms that does not call. Now, Oschmann appears to sense the threat of being overwritten a second time by the next generation of his students, a group that can no longer conceive the universal claim of equal validity of universally enough to make an exception here for the marginalized member of precisely that negative reference system from against which East Germans themselves could not derive identity anymore, but from and against which the younger generation apparently and also arguably can. This tension shapes the structure of the discourse in the book without tracing the representation conflict itself. It remains a point of unease, pointing to the incompatibility of postcolonialism by turning it against much earlier discourses on the West, like an anger that does not know where to go, as the past threatens to block itself from the future. Precisely where today the struggle unfolds between groups within structural power relations, Oschmann's own thesis turns against him. The construction of the East German would be more helpful from an identity political perspective than treating him as an East German in this apolitical sense as a part of the West and letting him fall along with it. What remains is the pain of history, which does not recognize that it is entirely fresh when speaking of old wounds, since it is primarily the pain over a missing political language in the present, a representation dilemma that East and West share. Okay, I will end it here and leave this last sentence as the conclusion. Thank you very much.